She didn't collapse. She didn't cry out for help. She didn't even stop showing up. From the outside, everything still looked functional. But inside, something had reached its limit. Not the dramatic kind of breaking point, the quiet one, where you realize you are exhausted in a way rest can't fix. She had been strong for too long. Not strong in the empowering sense, but in the survival sense. Pushing through days that felt heavy. Carrying responsibilities that never seemed to lighten. Telling herself, over and over, that she just needed to hold on a little longer. What made it harder was that nothing was wrong enough to justify stopping. No clear disaster. No single event she could point to and say, this is why. Just an accumulation of effort without relief. Endurance without reward. Motion without meaning. She noticed how often she told herself to keep going out of habit, not hope. How persistence had slowly turned into pressure. How motivation had been replaced by obligation. She wasn't chasing dreams anymore, she was managing survival. There were moments when she wondered if this was simply how life worked. If exhaustion was the price of responsibility. If feeling disconnected was normal once you reached a certain point. She questioned herself more than she questioned the system she was trapped in. What hurt most wasn't the tiredness. It was the sense that no matter how much effort she gave, nothing fundamentally changed. Progress felt superficial. Relief felt temporary. And deep down, she sensed that continuing this way would eventually cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. She didn't want to quit life. She just didn't know how to keep living it like this. That distinction mattered more than she realized at the time. In that quiet recognition, I can't keep going like this, something shifted. Not yet clarity. Not yet hope. But honesty. And honesty is often the first crack in the structure that keeps everything the same. She didn't know it yet, but this moment of truth was the beginning of understanding how everything really works. She had mastered the art of functioning while empty. Showing up on time. Answering messages. Completing tasks. Meeting expectations. From the outside, her life looked stable, even productive. But inside, every action required effort that felt disproportionate to the result. Nothing flowed. Everything demanded. She carried an invisible weight that followed her everywhere. Not just responsibilities, but expectations, her own and everyone else's. The expectation to be capable. To be reliable. To not fall apart. Over time, that expectation became an identity she didn't know how to put down. There were days when she felt like she was holding everything together with sheer willpower. One loose thread away from unraveling. Yet she never allowed herself to stop long enough to ask why things felt so heavy. Stopping felt dangerous. As if everything would collapse the moment she did. She noticed how her body mirrored this tension. Tight shoulders. Shallow breathing. A constant sense of urgency even during quiet moments. Rest didn't restore her, it only paused the pressure. The moment she resumed, the exhaustion returned. What drained her most was the feeling that she was responsible for making everything work. If something failed, she blamed herself. If something didn't improve, she tried harder. The idea that life might not be meant to feel this difficult never crossed her mind. She assumed struggle was normal. She rarely asked for help. Not because she didn't need it, but because she didn't know how to explain what was wrong. How do you describe a tiredness that comes from living out of alignment rather than from effort? The longer she carried this weight, the more disconnected she felt from herself. Decisions were made automatically. Days blended together. She was moving, but not choosing. Acting, but not feeling present. She told herself this phase would pass. That once she reached the next milestone, things would ease. But milestones came and went, and the heaviness remained. That pattern planted the first seed of doubt. For the first time, she considered the possibility that the problem wasn't her endurance. Maybe it was the way she had been taught to keep going. Maybe effort alone wasn't the answer. That thought lingered quietly, unsettling, but also strangely relieving. As if another way might exist, even if she couldn't see it yet. There came a moment when her usual strategies stopped working. Pushing harder didn't help. Staying busy didn't distract her. Even the routines she once relied on began to feel hollow, like motions performed without purpose. Life was moving, but meaning had quietly stepped out of the picture. She noticed how disconnected she felt from the reasons she once had for continuing. Goals that used to motivate her now felt distant, almost irrelevant. Not because she had failed, but because they no longer answered the deeper question forming inside her: why am I doing all of this? This confusion unsettled her more than exhaustion ever had. Tiredness could be managed. Doubt could not. She had always believed that effort would eventually lead to clarity, but now clarity seemed to be slipping further away the harder she tried. There were moments when she caught herself staring into space, mind blank, emotions muted. Not sadness. Not panic. Just a numb awareness that something fundamental was missing. She wasn't unhappy, she was misaligned. She questioned whether this was simply adulthood. Whether this quiet dissatisfaction was the cost of responsibility and growth. But deep down, she sensed that life wasn't meant to feel this lifeless. That something essential had been traded away along the way. What frightened her most was the thought of continuing indefinitely like this. Not breaking, not collapsing, just existing in a state of constant effort without connection. That realization pressed against her chest with urgency. For the first time, she allowed herself to ask a dangerous question: what if the way I've been living isn't how things are supposed to work? The question didn't bring answers. It brought silence. And that silence was uncomfortable. But inside that silence, something shifted. The certainty she had relied on began to crack. Not violently, gently. Enough to let doubt in. Enough to let curiosity follow. She didn't yet understand what was wrong. But she knew one thing clearly: continuing without understanding would cost her more than stopping ever could. That realization marked the end of endurance, and the beginning of inquiry. She didn't look for answers right away. In fact, she avoided them at first. Asking deeper questions felt risky, like pulling a thread that might unravel everything she had built. But once the question appeared, it refused to disappear. If effort alone isn't working, what am I missing? The question echoed quietly through her days, showing up in moments of stillness, in pauses between tasks, in the silence before sleep. It wasn't demanding. It was persistent. She began to notice how rarely she had questioned the structure of her life. She had questioned herself constantly, her discipline, her motivation, her resilience, but never the system she was operating within. The assumption had always been that if something wasn't working, she needed to try harder. That realization was uncomfortable. It suggested that her exhaustion wasn't a personal failure, but a consequence of misunderstanding how things actually functioned. And if that were true, then endurance wasn't the solution, awareness was. She started observing patterns instead of judging outcomes. How effort didn't always correlate with results. How some people seemed to move with ease while others struggled endlessly, regardless of intelligence or dedication. Something didn't add up. This observation didn't make her cynical. It made her curious. Curious enough to pause before reacting. Curious enough to stop pushing for a moment and simply watch how life responded when she didn't force it. She noticed subtle differences. Moments when letting go led to smoother outcomes. Times when resistance created unnecessary friction. These weren't dramatic changes, just small inconsistencies that hinted at a deeper truth. For the first time, she considered that life might be responding more to her internal state than to her external effort. That alignment, not force, might be the missing element she had never been taught. The idea felt both relieving and unsettling. Relieving because it suggested another way existed. Unsettling because it meant she would have to unlearn much of what she believed about control and progress. She didn't have answers yet. But she had something just as important, a new direction. Instead of asking how to keep going, she began asking how things truly work. And that shift, subtle as it seemed, opened the door to everything that came next. As she paid closer attention, she realized something unsettling. No one had ever taught her how life actually responds to energy, intention, or internal alignment. She had been taught discipline, responsibility, hard work. But not awareness. Not flow. Not how the inner world shapes the outer one. She noticed how often she acted from tension without realizing it. How her decisions were driven by fear of falling behind rather than trust in timing. How her thoughts constantly rehearsed worst-case scenarios, as if preparation alone could prevent them. This wasn't about blaming anyone. She understood that most people were taught the same way: effort over alignment, control over trust. It was the system she had inherited, not consciously chosen. The more she observed, the more patterns emerged. On days when she felt calm and present, things unfolded with surprising ease. On days when she pushed from anxiety, obstacles multiplied. It wasn't coincidence, it was consistency. She began to suspect that life wasn't responding to how much she tried, but to how she showed up internally. To the state she carried into each moment. That realization reframed everything she thought she knew about success, struggle, and progress. This understanding didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments. Small realizations layered over time. Each one quietly weakening the belief that exhaustion was necessary for forward movement. She realized how rarely she had checked in with herself emotionally before acting. She planned. She executed. She adjusted. But she didn't align. And without alignment, effort had been draining rather than expansive. This wasn't spiritual bypassing. It didn't deny responsibility or action. It simply suggested that action without alignment leads to resistance, while aligned action creates momentum. For the first time, she stopped asking herself how much more she could endure. Instead, she asked a new question: what happens when I change the way I engage with life, rather than trying to overpower it? That question marked the beginning of real understanding, not as theory, but as lived experience. Once that understanding settled in, she noticed how often she had been fighting life without realizing it. Fighting timing. Fighting outcomes. Fighting herself. Every delay felt like failure. Every obstacle felt personal. She had been treating life as something to overcome, rather than something to work with. She began experimenting quietly. Nothing dramatic. Just small shifts in how she responded. Pausing before reacting. Breathing before deciding. Allowing moments to unfold without immediately trying to control them. At first, this felt unnatural, almost irresponsible, as if she were letting go of the very thing that had kept her moving. But something unexpected happened. When she stopped forcing solutions, clarity arrived faster. When she stopped chasing answers, insight surfaced on its own. The energy she had spent resisting began to return to her in the form of presence. She realized how much of her exhaustion had come from internal conflict. Wanting one thing while fearing another. Acting while doubting. Moving forward while bracing for disappointment. That friction had drained her more than effort ever could. As she softened her grip, situations began to resolve with less effort. Conversations flowed more easily. Decisions felt lighter. Not because life became perfect, but because she wasn't meeting it with tension anymore. She understood then that alignment doesn't mean passivity. It means responding from clarity instead of fear. acting from trust instead of urgency, letting intuition guide timing rather than forcing movement. This shift felt unfamiliar but relieving. For the first time, she wasn't pushing herself past her limits to prove strength. She was allowing herself to move in rhythm with something larger than her own will. She noticed how her body responded to this change. Her breath deepened. Her shoulders relaxed. The constant background urgency softened into calm awareness. It was as if her nervous system finally felt permission to rest. She didn't abandon responsibility. She redefined it. Responsibility no longer meant carrying everything alone. It meant choosing how she showed up, internally, before taking action. In letting go of the fight, she didn't lose momentum. She gained coherence. And coherence, she was beginning to learn, is how everything really starts to work. As the fight dissolved, she noticed a deeper change taking place, one she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer operating from survival mode. For years, her decisions had been shaped by the need to endure, to stay afloat, to make it through another day without falling behind. Now, that constant pressure began to loosen. She became aware of how survival thinking had narrowed her world. When you're focused on getting through, you stop noticing what's around you. You stop listening to your intuition. You stop asking what you actually want. Awareness had been sacrificed for efficiency. With that awareness returning, she started to see patterns she had missed before. How certain situations drained her energy while others quietly restored it. How some choices felt heavy even before she made them. These signals had always been there, she just hadn't had the space to notice them. She realized that survival keeps you moving, but awareness shows you where you're going. Without awareness, effort becomes directionless. And directionlessness had been the hidden source of her exhaustion. This understanding changed how she approached each day. Instead of asking, "What do I need to get done?" she began asking, "How do I want to feel while doing it?" That single shift altered her priorities more than any productivity system ever had. She noticed how her nervous system responded when she honored awareness. Tension eased. Focus sharpened. Decisions became simpler, not because life was easier, but because she was finally listening to herself. This wasn't self-indulgence. It was self-regulation. Awareness allowed her to engage with life intelligently instead of reactively. To choose responses rather than default to habits formed under pressure. She began to trust that awareness itself was a form of guidance. That when she paid attention to her internal state, external decisions aligned more naturally. Life didn't need to be micromanaged, it needed to be felt. The shift from survival to awareness didn't happen overnight. But once it began, it was irreversible. She couldn't unsee what she had learned. And that clarity made returning to blind endurance impossible. For the first time, she sensed that understanding how everything works wasn't about controlling outcomes. It was about aligning perception. And that alignment was quietly changing her life from the inside out. With awareness guiding her, she began to move differently through life. Not faster. Not slower. Just more intentionally. Each step felt considered, not calculated. She no longer rushed to fill silence or avoid discomfort. She allowed moments to exist without immediately trying to fix them. She noticed how often she had mistaken urgency for importance. How quickly she reacted simply because something demanded attention, not because it truly mattered. That realization reshaped her relationship with time. Not everything needed an immediate response. Some things needed presence. This shift didn't make her careless. It made her precise. She conserved energy by choosing where to engage fully and where to let things unfold. The constant pressure to be everywhere, to do everything, quietly dissolved. She realized that when she moved from awareness, outcomes changed without extra effort. Conversations became clearer. Boundaries felt natural instead of defensive. Even challenges felt more manageable because she met them grounded rather than braced. There was a growing trust in her own rhythm. She stopped comparing her pace to others. Comparison had once fueled her movement, now it felt irrelevant. Alignment replaced competition. She understood that life responds to consistency of state, not intensity of effort. When her internal state remained calm and present, external situations adjusted more smoothly. Resistance had been the hidden friction all along. This understanding simplified everything. Instead of trying to master every circumstance, she focused on mastering her engagement with them. Presence became her anchor. Awareness became her compass. She didn't announce this change. She didn't explain it to anyone. But those around her felt it. Her energy shifted. Interactions softened. The world met her differently because she was meeting herself differently. This wasn't enlightenment. It was embodiment. A quiet integration of understanding into daily life. And that integration made everything feel lighter without becoming shallow. She didn't yet see where this path would lead. But for the first time, she trusted that the way she was moving now would take her somewhere real. Something subtle but unmistakable shifted as she continued living from awareness instead of pressure. Effort was still present in her life, but it no longer felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. She was doing the same things, facing similar responsibilities, yet the internal strain that once drained her energy had quietly disappeared. She realized that what had exhausted her was never the effort itself, but the emotional tension attached to it. Fear had been woven into every action, fear of falling behind, fear of disappointing others, fear that stopping would make everything collapse. That fear had been running in the background constantly, turning even simple tasks into heavy burdens. Now, her actions came from a different place. She moved because something felt aligned, not because she was afraid of what would happen if she didn't. This shift changed the quality of her energy completely. Effort no longer felt like self-betrayal. It felt intentional, clean, and sustainable. She noticed how much energy she recovered simply by removing internal resistance. When she stopped arguing with herself, questioning every step, or bracing for failure, her body responded immediately. Tasks required less force. Focus lasted longer. Fatigue softened instead of accumulating. There was a new sense of cooperation within her. Her thoughts, emotions, and actions were no longer pulling in opposite directions. When alignment replaced inner conflict, momentum returned naturally, without pressure or urgency. She understood then that effort becomes heavy only when it's disconnected from meaning. When action is driven by fear or obligation, it drains more than it gives. But when effort is aligned with awareness, it supports rather than depletes. This realization freed her from the belief that rest had to be earned through exhaustion. She allowed herself to pause without guilt, trusting that rest was not a reward, but a necessary part of clarity and sustainability. She became more selective with her energy. Not everything required her full attention. Not every demand deserved a response. Awareness helped her distinguish between what truly mattered and what she had been doing out of habit. The more intentional she became, the lighter her life felt. Not smaller, clearer. Complexity began to organize itself naturally once resistance was removed. She saw now that understanding how everything really works wasn't about avoiding effort. It was about removing the invisible weight that made effort unbearable. And with that weight gone, continuing no longer felt impossible. As her relationship with effort changed, a deeper understanding began to take shape. She started to see that life wasn't reacting to how hard she pushed, but to the state she carried into each moment. Results were not responding to force, they were responding to alignment. She noticed patterns she had missed before. On days when she felt calm, present, and grounded, situations unfolded with less friction. Conversations flowed more easily. Decisions resolved faster. When she moved from tension, obstacles multiplied. The difference was consistent enough to be undeniable. This realization reframed her entire experience of cause and effect. She had been taught that outcomes were earned through struggle. But now she saw that struggle often distorted outcomes instead of producing them. Life mirrored her internal state with surprising accuracy. She began to understand that everything responds, not selectively, not emotionally, but neutrally. Thoughts, emotions, and expectations were constantly setting the tone. Life didn't judge them. It reflected them. This understanding didn't make her passive. It made her responsible in a new way. Instead of managing everything externally, she started managing her inner alignment. Clarity became the priority. Presence became the foundation. She realized how often she had tried to change circumstances without changing the state from which she was engaging with them. That mismatch had been the source of frustration. When the inner state shifted, the outer response followed naturally. There was relief in this awareness. It meant she didn't need to control every variable. She needed to remain coherent. When her thoughts, emotions, and actions pointed in the same direction, life responded with less resistance. She stopped asking why things weren't working and started observing how she was meeting them. That single adjustment brought insight faster than years of effort ever had. Understanding that everything responds didn't give her instant answers. It gave her stability. A sense of orientation. She finally knew where to place her attention. And once she understood how everything really works, continuing no longer felt like survival. It felt like participation. With this understanding settling in, she noticed how her need for control began to loosen. For years, she had tried to manage outcomes, anticipate problems, and prevent disappointment by thinking ahead. Control had felt like safety. Now she saw it had been a response to fear, not wisdom. She realized that clarity does not come from predicting every possibility. It comes from being present enough to respond when the moment arrives. When she stopped rehearsing the future in her mind, her attention returned to what was actually happening. And what was happening felt manageable. This shift changed how she approached uncertainty. Instead of tightening when she didn't know what would come next, she stayed open. Uncertainty no longer felt like a threat, it felt like space. Space for new information, new options, and new responses to appear. She noticed how much energy she had been spending trying to guarantee outcomes. That energy, once released, returned to her as calm focus. She was no longer scattered between imagined futures. Her thoughts aligned with the present, and her body followed. Clarity replaced control quietly. There was no dramatic decision to stop planning or caring. She still made choices, still set intentions, still acted responsibly. But she no longer tried to dominate timing or force resolution. She understood that control narrows perception, while clarity expands it. When she loosened her grip, she could see more clearly. Solutions appeared that she couldn't have planned for. Conversations unfolded in ways she hadn't anticipated. This didn't make her reckless. It made her precise. She responded instead of reacting. She chose instead of bracing. And those choices felt cleaner, less emotionally charged. She realized that life works best when met with attention rather than pressure. When awareness leads, action becomes effective without being exhausting. Control had been exhausting her. Clarity restored her. In releasing the need to control how things unfolded, she didn't lose direction. She gained alignment. And alignment allowed life to move with her instead of against her. For the first time, she felt that understanding how everything really works wasn't about mastering life, it was about meeting it clearly. With clarity guiding her, she felt the need to anchor this understanding into something tangible. Not as a rule or a ritual, but as a way to stay connected to herself when life became noisy again. Awareness had opened the door, now she needed a practice to keep it open. She began using a simple notebook she called Journal Manifestation. Not to demand outcomes or script the future, but to observe herself. Each day, she wrote from where she actually was, not where she thought she should be. This honesty became grounding. She noticed how writing slowed her down. It created a pause between thought and reaction. Instead of carrying everything internally, she placed it on the page. Questions. Realizations. Emotional patterns she had never fully acknowledged before. Over time, the journal became a mirror rather than a tool. It reflected her internal state back to her with clarity. On days when she felt aligned, her writing felt calm and spacious. On days when tension returned, it showed up immediately on the page. This practice didn't fix her life overnight. But it stabilized her awareness. It reminded her to check in before acting. To notice her state before making decisions. To align internally before engaging externally. She realized how powerful this was. Life responded more smoothly when she responded to herself first. The journal wasn't manifesting outcomes, it was aligning her with how things actually work. Through this grounded practice, understanding stopped being abstract. It became lived. Integrated. Something she could return to whenever old habits tried to pull her back into survival. The more consistent she became with this practice, the less she needed external reassurance. Her sense of direction came from within. And that inner reference point changed everything. She understood now that insight without integration fades. But insight grounded in daily awareness becomes transformation. And this simple practice ensured that what she had learned would stay with her. As this understanding became part of her daily rhythm, she noticed something subtle but undeniable: life began to meet her differently. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But consistently. Situations that once felt heavy started to soften. Delays resolved with less friction. Conversations shifted without effort. She realized that nothing external had changed first, she had. Her posture toward life was no longer tense or defensive. She approached situations with openness instead of expectation. And that openness seemed to invite cooperation rather than resistance. Opportunities appeared in ordinary ways. A conversation that arrived at the right moment. An idea that surfaced without force. A door that opened not because she pushed harder, but because she was finally aligned to walk through it. These moments felt natural, not miraculous, and that made them even more powerful. She noticed how she no longer chased validation. She trusted her internal clarity enough to move without constant reassurance. This quiet confidence changed how others responded to her. People listened differently. Circumstances adjusted more smoothly. There was less urgency, yet more progress. Less effort, yet more movement. She wasn't trying to control outcomes anymore, she was allowing alignment to lead action. And life seemed to respond to that coherence with ease. She understood then that manifestation isn't about forcing reality to comply. It's about removing the internal resistance that blocks natural flow. When resistance fades, life doesn't need to be convinced, it responds automatically. This realization brought a deep sense of relief. She no longer felt like she was behind. Timing didn't feel like an enemy. Everything arrived when it was able to be received. She felt supported, not because life became perfect, but because she was finally moving in a way that allowed support to reach her. And in that steady response from life, she saw confirmation, not as proof, but as resonance. She was aligned. And alignment was working. At some point, she noticed that doubt no longer had the same power over her. It still appeared, quietly, as it always does, but it didn't take the lead anymore. Doubt became a signal, not a verdict. A reminder to return to awareness rather than a reason to stop. She realized that before, doubt had kept her stuck because she demanded certainty before moving. Now, she understood that clarity doesn't arrive before action, it unfolds through aligned action. Waiting for absolute certainty had been another form of control disguised as caution. This shifted how she related to the process itself. She no longer questioned every delay or outcome. She trusted that alignment was doing its work even when results weren't immediately visible. Silence no longer meant failure. It meant integration. She noticed how peace replaced urgency. Not because she had everything she wanted, but because she trusted how things were unfolding. The need to constantly check progress, compare timelines, or seek reassurance dissolved naturally. There was a quiet confidence growing inside her, not the loud kind that announces itself, but the steady kind that doesn't need validation. She felt grounded in her own understanding, no longer swayed by external opinions or temporary fluctuations. She understood that when you stop doubting the process, energy stops leaking. Focus sharpens. Presence deepens. Life doesn't need to be rushed when it's being met with trust. This didn't mean she stopped caring. It meant she stopped interfering. She allowed things to develop without pulling them apart through overanalysis. Trust became an active choice, not a passive hope. For the first time, she felt truly inside her life instead of watching it from a distance. And that sense of participation changed everything. She didn't need proof anymore. The alignment itself was enough. And with that, the process no longer felt fragile, it felt inevitable. Looking back, she could finally see why she had reached that breaking point. It wasn't because she was weak. It wasn't because she lacked discipline or resilience. It was because she had been living disconnected from how life actually responds. She had been trying to survive in a system that requires alignment, not sacrifice. She understood now that the exhaustion she once felt was not a sign to quit, it was a signal to change direction. Her body, her emotions, her resistance had all been trying to communicate something she hadn't been taught how to hear. Almost giving up was not failure. It was feedback. She realized that everything she had endured had led her here. Not as punishment, but as preparation. Without that pressure, she might never have questioned the rules she had been living by. Without that fatigue, she might never have slowed down enough to listen. There was compassion in this realization. For herself. For the version of her who kept going without understanding. Who believed effort alone was enough. Who didn't know there was another way to move through life. She saw clearly now, life hadn't been blocking her. It had been responding perfectly to the state she was carrying. Once that state shifted, the response changed, not because life suddenly became kind, but because alignment allowed her to receive. This understanding softened her relationship with the past. Regret dissolved. Self-blame lost its grip. Everything made sense in a way it never had before. She no longer wished she had known sooner. She knew she learned exactly when she was ready to integrate it. And that timing felt precise, not delayed. What once felt like the end of her capacity became the doorway to real understanding. And she knew, without doubt, that almost giving up had been the moment everything actually began. If she could leave one message behind, it would be this: if you feel like you can't keep going, it doesn't mean you're failing. It means something deeper is asking to be understood. Exhaustion is not always a lack of strength, sometimes it's a lack of alignment. Life doesn't respond to force the way we're taught it does. It responds to coherence. To presence. To the state you meet each moment with. When that state shifts, everything else follows, quietly, naturally, inevitably. You don't need to hold everything together forever. You don't need to prove your worth through endurance. You don't need to push past your limits to earn peace. Understanding how everything really works changes the rules entirely. The moment you stop fighting life and start meeting it with awareness, something opens. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But steadily. And that steadiness is what lasts. Nothing in your experience has been wasted. Every moment of confusion, every pause, Every doubt has been guiding you toward clarity, even when it didn't feel like it. Sometimes, the moment you think you can't go on is not the end of your strength. It's the beginning of understanding. And understanding is where everything truly starts to work.